the food security, because the agriculture sector accounts for the larger use of groundwater. So it's important to have a continued progress in groundwater governance, because it's central to slowing the depletion of groundwater. And of course, this governance must entail methods which regulate use and encourage water efficiency, crop productivity. So the sustainable management of groundwater resource required good planning and concerted efforts. So in addition to responding to acute resource degradation, planning for groundwater protection needs the attention of all of us. So in this case, this is why we choose Mr. Femelo Makoba project, because, because as a flagship project, because it provides us with secure water access to the population, and then also in many cases it's showing how to monitor the information on the data we can find on the groundwater management. Mr. Makoba is a groundwater management technician. He has several hats. He's also a water resource specialist at the Department of Water and Sanitation in Botswana. He has more than 14 years experience working at the Department of Water Affairs. And he received a diploma in water and environmental engineering, awarded with a merit at the University of Botswana. So we will follow the same pattern, having his presentation, and then we will have the question. So Mr. Makoba, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, yes, please. Thank you. My name is Femelo Makoba, like it has been mentioned, and I'll be taking you through a presentation on optimizing groundwater management in Botswana. We focus on the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector is one of the sectors that drive the economy for our country in Botswana. So that is why we settle for that sector, in case you are asking yourself why the agricultural sector. Oh, just a brief overview of Botswana. Botswana is a landlocked country in the southern part of Africa, and we experience semi-arid climate conditions with extremely high regionalized rainfall patterns. Our economy, like I mentioned, relies on the mining, and the second to mining is the agricultural sector. And our mandate as a DWS is to sustainably manage water resources in Botswana. And by management of water resources, we look into the quality, we look into the quantity. And to do this, we have monitoring sites for the groundwater resources. We have the monitoring boreholes, which are around 2.4 monitoring boreholes throughout the country. And we do this in operating well fields only. And in Botswana, we have about 42 operating well fields. You can see from the slide there that the well fields are not actually covering the whole of the country, and it covers just a small ratio of the country. And this is the current scenario. This is the 2.4 boreholes that we are monitoring for quality and quantity against the private boreholes, that is the boreholes owned by farmers in Botswana. The private boreholes are about 30,000, and the monitored boreholes that are owned by the government are around 2.4, which basically is 8% of the whole boreholes in Botswana. And the question is this really representative enough to rely on such data for analysis and management? And one thing that we should note is that those 2.4 boreholes are just in the built-up areas. They are not in the rural areas. They are not in the villages. They are just in the built-up areas. And to do this, we had to select a few boreholes owned by private individuals, private farmers. On this one, we went for the farmers who are not actually, or who cannot actually sustain groundwater management from the funding, or who needs the funding for such a projects. These are the two sites that we have chosen. The one is in the northwestern part of Botswana is Habu. This site is for the poverty eradication scheme for cluster gardening. And here, the issue here is that we don't know the quality of the water that we are supplying to those villages. And the other one is in the central part of Botswana. This is a borehole owned by one such is in a place called Twishaga, and it's owned by a widow. And you know, when this is the scenario, you can see how the borehole looks like, how it looks like around the borehole. And these people, they use this water also to drink. They don't just use it for agricultural purposes, they use it to drink also as well. So you can see how extreme it is. And these are the other two sites. The other one is in Molalata, the eastern part of Botswana. And it is also for the poverty eradication scheme for cluster gardening. This is for horticultural activities. And it has been equipped with solar. It is using solar right now. The issue on this one is also on quality. We don't know the quality of the water that these people are using for their domestic uses. And the other one is in Mahakabi, still in the central part of Botswana, owned by some indigenous group of people there who are using the water also for human consumption, and whatever water needs they have, they use such water. And then the question is the current situation or the current approach, is it representative enough in terms of groundwater management in our country? And another question is, what happens to the rights of those people who are living in the rural areas? What happens to the right to clean waters? What happens to the right to healthy waters? And whose responsibility is this? And the possible hindrances towards sustainably managing those water resources in those areas. This is a closer look into the current scenarios. One of the boreholes that are owned by one of the farmers, you can see down there, a lot of oil spillages, and that is a risk of pollution at a point source. This is only because we talk of educating, we talk of groundwater management, we talk of water management, but we don't actually get the people who use those water resources to teach them how to actually clean or how to manage the water resources. That is why we see such incidences because of lack of education. In terms of the activities that we are intending to do with this grant, one of the most important activities is on education, educating the farmers on good management of boreholes, educating them on the surrounding, just the surrounding of the borehole, how it should look like. This is one of the boreholes that we are using for. It belongs to one of the government departments. We are saying if the government can do this, we can also teach our people to maintain their boreholes like this. And we'll be teaching them also on issues of groundwater sample collections, because we are on this project, we don't want to be seen to be doing everything. We don't want to be seen to be giving them everything. As education continues, we'll also be teaching them on data collection, that is water level collection and abstraction collection. And we'll be also be teaching them on how to input that data on the borehole logs. And we'll also be interpreting the results for them and advising them where we see the need. And the second activity will be on installation. You see, in each and every borehole that we have chosen for this pilot project, we are intending to install the deeper access tubes, and we are intending to install the flow meters in each and every borehole. And this is the activity that we will be doing on installation. Already we have 3 boreholes that have been installed with the deeper access tubes. The only thing missing in them is the flow meter readings or flow meters to be installed. So basically, we'll be installing the deep access tubes and the flow meter. The deep access tube is just used for the collection of the water levels. And in some cases, you'll find out that the boreholes or the drinking troughs are just close to the borehole itself. And we are saying we'll be helping them to relocate those borehole, those drinking troughs. Will be helping them to relocate them a bit further from the boreholes to avoid pollution from point source. One of the things that we are doing, or that we'll be doing, is to install the reservoirs or connecting the reservoirs to the boreholes and eventually connecting the reservoirs to the drinking troughs. The reason why we went for the reservoirs is that in some cases you'll find out that they're pumping the water directly to the drinking troughs, and that results in waste of water, because a lot of water is being spilled out of the reservoirs, of the drinking troughs. So if you have the reservoirs for each and every borehole, then even the sustainability of the groundwater in that particular borehole, the water level fluctuations can be sustained. The method that we'll be using. You see, when you talk of the method that we'll be using, the first thing that you should ask yourself is what is on the ground. Currently, we have some policies. We have like the abstraction raise policies. When we give you a water right, or when we give you the permission to draw water from your borehole or from wherever, we give you the abstraction rate that you should use. But the thing is, you cannot just tell someone to observe a certain rate or to observe a certain pumping rate without first teaching that person how to do that. This is currently what we are doing. Like you see, that lady is calling an 8 months old child to come to her. She's expecting her to come standing up, but that can never happen because the child has never been taught how to walk. This is the current situation that we are experiencing, or that we have in our country. And we are saying, with the suggested method, we are saying, let us teach these farmers, let us teach these people how to sustainably manage the groundwater resources, how to sustainably manage their boreholes. Instead of telling them how to do that, let us engage them, let us give them the ownership of the management itself. And then there comes a part of the results. Yes, one of the ideas to help these farmers to excite them, we are planning on coming up with the results in a hydrographs and show them what actually happens to the water levels, to the boreholes in terms of where the water level is concerned. And we'll be doing also that for the quality. We'll be doing that for quality also and for abstraction also, so that they can see, they can feel what is happening to the boreholes. In terms of scaling up, we are saying, should this pilot project be a success, to be seen to be a success, we'll need to have something on ground that can help us to take it up, or to take it at a further level. We'll need more funding. We'll need to set up a permanent office, or a permanent project office that will be focused strictly on the groundwater management in the agricultural sector. And we'll do more capacity building with a more focus on the farmers. In conclusion, we are saying the situation of Botswana is that climate change has closed the chapter for dependence on the surface water that we used to do before. Now the focus is on the groundwater resources. That's where our hope is. That is why we want to move before time. That is why we want to move right now to make sure we protect this important commodity. And in the case of Botswana, we are saying availability of the groundwater is not a problem. What is the problem is the sustainability and the quality of this water. Because okay. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Makoba, for this very informative session. I would like to ask the judges if they have any question.
Start?
Sure. Sure. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I was fascinated by looking at the Botswana situation, and particularly in relation to the boreholes and groundwater, and with the sinking groundwater levels anywhere in the world, particularly in some region of Botswana. I found that very interesting. But what will you do with the data collected from the borehole monitoring? You asked really good questions here in the slides that you showed. But surely you must have some working hypothesis of outcomes, of results, and that you are then going to teach to the farmers and to educate the population in relation to it. But do you have knowledge of previous experiences and what the results were and how they were implemented?
You want to answer now or take a
we can
roll of
continue.
We can take another question.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I think it's a fantastic description of what happens in the field and the reality. So I would like to know how you are doing your planning for the visits. I mean, I see that you have started doing this monitoring. Which is the criteria that you are using at the moment for selecting the sites that you are going to visit and that you are going to monitor? And if you can link that criteria with the human rights approach, it will be fantastic. Are you considering poverty rates? Are you considering availability of water? Are you consider which kind of the different water users? So which is the criteria for your planning actually in the monitoring? Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for such an interesting presentation. I have a general question and a specific question, actually. My general question is regarding groundwater in general. Like, why did you decide on those proposed boreholes? Why those sites? Did you take into account recharge zones, discharge zones? Did you have any information available beforehand about the level, like how many meters down do you have access to the water source or not? What's the quality like? What's the conditions, of the groundwaters? Is it, like what kind of an aquifer is beneath? If you have any information whatsoever on that, and what decided you to try those boreholes, propose those boreholes in particular? And also another question more on the human rights based approach would be what would be the cost of drawing water from those boreholes, and who could maintain it? Who would be in charge of the maintenance of those boreholes? Would it be the Department of Water and Sanitation? Could it be the people, the beneficiaries from the water users? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. You should.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, what degree of community engagement are you undertaking before you select sites, and how are you getting the community to buy into the monitoring process, in addition to their day-to-day lives and jobs and things?
Okay. Thank you.
Answer before we take question from the audiences.
No, let me take this one first. Thank you. The first question was on the results interpretation part. What we are planning to do, or what we've been doing in terms of groundwater management, like I mentioned, we've been only monitoring from the 2.4 boreholes that are owned by the government. Now we want to extend that to the farmers, to the individual farmers, or to the agricultural sector. What we are planning to do is that for each and every borehole that we will be using for this pilot study, we'll be taking the results, interpret them, sit down with the farmers, and we take them through the interpretation. We teach them this is what means when the results are like this. This is what it means to in your borehole, or to your water quality, or to your water quantity, or whatever aspect we'll be looking at that particular time. And then we'll also teach them how to, the corrective measures, what they need to implement, what they need to do to rectify the whatever transpired. And then the other one is the criteria of I think it's criteria of monitoring, if I get it correct. Oh, okay. For the water level monitoring, we are proposing that the farmers, like I said, we'll be teaching them. We are proposing that the farmers will be the ones who will be doing the actual monitoring. One before they start pumping, and then secondly after stopping pumping. This is important for us to see even the drawdown of the water for a particular borehole, and then we will be able to advise them in terms of the pumping rate or the pumping time and the behavior of the borehole. The criteria is such that they monitor every time they start pumping, they will take the water reading, and then every time they stop pumping, they will take the water reading, and even the flow meter reading, they will record it on the logbook. And as for the quality, because it's a bit technical, as the department we have said, okay, for this pilot project, every week we'll go to the sites and we take the water samples and analyze them in the lab, and then go back to the site, to the borehole owners with the results and interpret them for them. And the other question was why these boreholes? Well, like she has mentioned, I've been working on the groundwater management for almost 14 years, and I've been working all around Botswana. So it gave me the opportunity to see or to go around and see what is basically happening on the ground before I can actually sit down and think of the boreholes that I can use for such a project. And then the issue of maintenance. We should know that these are the boreholes owned by farmers. It means they are the ones who are responsible for their maintenance. What we are coming up with is the issue of sustainability of the water and the issue of quality of the water that they are drinking. Because there's no how we can stop them from drinking such waters. So that is where we get in. The maintenance will be left with them. Of course, we can advise them, but the maintenance will be solely the responsibility. And the last question was on engagement, community engagement, before we choose this size. I should mention that we have chosen the size on the office, looking at the distribution of the boreholes, looking at what is happening on the ground. We are yet to go and sit down with the groups that use these boreholes so that we can now agree with them. We didn't want a situation whereby we sit down with them and agree that this is what we want to do in a borehole, and we don't come to do that. So we said, okay, let us go and present first, and if we are granted, if we are funded, then we go and sit down and teach them for maybe a week or something. I don't know if I have left any question from the judges.
Now we will take questions from the audiences. Sir? Louder, please.
If I have understood the problem correctly, the pollution of the borehole is happening because the pollutants are entering the borehole, or is it through groundwater discharge? If the pollution is happening because the pollutants are entering the borehole, then how about raising the casing pipe above the ground level, maybe 3 feet above the ground level, so that the pollutants do not enter the borehole, actual borehole? Then the other possibility could be a kind of platform around the borehole so that you don't allow stagnation of pollutants just at the borehole point, and provide some kind of slope they can flow down to a far off place and avoid contamination of the borehole. Second thing is groundwater. The pollution is caused by the owners of the boreholes, but the groundwater must be treated as a community property. So there is a responsibility on the owner of the borehole to avoid contamination of borewell, because the water belongs to the whole community. So the entire community also has to put some kind of pressure on those who are owning the borewells. So there's a kind of obligation on the owners of the boreholes to ensure that there is no contamination of the groundwater.
Thank you. Are you, do you have a question?
Okay, maybe while you're
Okay.
still waiting for the question, maybe I can answer that one.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that question. Your suggestion is that maybe we should raise the casing of the boreholes. But the question is, do we really need that pollution to be taking place in that area around the boreholes? And the other suggestion is that maybe we should engage the community to put pressure on the borehole owners. But the position is that, or what we are saying is that we can talk about these things. We can have the project groups, the community project groups, but the bottom line is, have we taught the borehole owner about the borehole management? That's where we are coming in, to teach them about the management of the boreholes before you can go to maybe engage in the community to put pressure on them. And then on the issue of raising the cases, it doesn't actually address the issue of pollution, because if I'm getting you clearly, what you are saying is that if the casing is raised, then the oil spillages we are fine with them because they don't get into the water in the borehole, of which I think it will not be addressing the current problem. So education. Thank you.
No. I'm sorry. We have more questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I read correctly, the time series you showed us, I know it was only one example out of many boreholes. What I saw on this graphic is two things. One is over the period, there was a lot of variability, but at the same time, there was a significant trend down. If the vertical scale was in meter, it was probably of the order of 3 to 4 meters down. So if that's the case, do you have a process to advise farmers when such a use is clearly unsustainable? The second point is that there were 4 or 5 points which were completely off the normal variation. And this is one of the issues with citizen science, is that do you have a process to have some quality control, to identify these points which are clearly not reflecting any measure, any reasonable measure, but which are maybe due to some, I don't know, some error in monitoring or some other thing? Because to trust the result, you also need to have in place, and maybe it's part of the education process as well, to have in place a quality control. Thank you.
And we have one last question from the audience. Sir? No? Okay. So I have a question for you as well. Thank you, Michel. You, as Maria asked before, it's like you saying you're doing the trainings to the farmers, or you're teaching them and you're having their education. So my points, which way of training do you use, and if do you use a human right-based approach to the trainings to make the farmers know about the access and the information to water? Thank you.
Can you come again with that question?
The last question.
No, I mean your question. Can you repeat the question
I'm
again?
sorry?
Can you repeat the question again?
Oh, sure. I said, the question is, like, what kind of mean do you use to educate or teach the farmers? And if you use a human right-based approach to teach them about the access and information of water?
Okay, thank you. First of all, on the quality check, that example that I used is a borehole building in the government is used for observation purposes. The 5 off readings, and it's good that you observed that the 5 off readings were when we're running the borehole for the borehole water sampling, when we're collecting the samples. What we decided to do is that we decided to take the readings immediately after sampling the boreholes. Those are boreholes that are not operating. So for us to take water sample from them, we had to pump them. And we deliberately included the readings in the hydrograph so that we can know what happens to the water level should this borehole be pumped in the near future. I don't know if I addressed it in full. And then when it comes to the education means, in one of the boreholes that we have chosen, the one that is, I said, is in the eastern part of Botswana, we have actually trained the group that is using the borehole right now. We took them into a mini classroom where there were lots and lots of demonstrations before we went to the field, to the actual borehole, to now get them hands-on in terms of water level monitoring, in terms of taking the readings from the flow meters, and how to actually record those readings on the logbook.
The last part of the question.
Okay.
Sorry. How do you integrate human rights approach to the teaching of the farmers?
How do we integrate human rights approach? I'm not quite sure if I'm getting the question clearly. Maybe if you can expand the question a bit so that I answer you.
The question is just to make the farmers aware that, the water is a human right. So how do you make sure that they know their rights to water and sanitation? How do you integrate this data in the teaching? Do you have any example, or how do you teach them, or do you understand?
The reason why we emphasize more on education is so that we can cover such topics in full, so that we can. One of the ideas is that they should own groundwater management, not because we want the good quality data, but because it's a health to them.
Okay.
It's good for them to have healthy waters.
Okay, thank you.
One more question.
In terms of a human rights-based approach, I think the examples that might help you are, are you including? Hello, sorry, I'm Amanda. Can you hear me now? Right. So the question I have is: are you including women in the community engagement where you're doing the education, and are you making sure that people can participate if they aren't able to get there because they're not in the local immediate vicinity? So it's about inclusivity and making sure that everybody has access to that training, and making sure that you're representing different types of marginalized people in the community engagement process, so that you're able to understand better who needs the whatever the product is that you're trying to teach them in, and understand the needs of the community better.
Thank you. If I got the question well, it talks of how do we make sure that the people who come for the training are the people we want them to come for the training? How does it address the marginalized groups? The boreholes that we have chosen for the pilot study, 3 of them belong to cluster groups for poverty eradication. That is one of the marginalized groups. And one of the boreholes, it belongs to the indigenous group. This group is made of people from different settlements within Botswana. They've been taken and put them in one place, and then the government decided to dig a borehole for them. Now, what is going to happen is that everyone who drinks from that borehole, when you do the training, everyone who drinks from that borehole, we make sure that they come for the training, and the trainings are not done in anywhere apart from the borehole. We do all our trainings on site, so that everyone can be able to come there, to eliminate the issue of accessibility, to eliminate the issue of transportation to the training facilities. We have said every training should be done at the particular borehole.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if we have a final round of questions from the judges. Okay, so Mr. Makoba, thank you very much for this informative session. It was very good to know the importance of monitoring and better planning for the groundwater use, both by the government and the farmers. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to our presenter, Bill Mello, and our moderator, Cynthia. I'd like to introduce Dirk Hanschel, professor at the Martin Luther University in Halle, who will moderate this session.
Thank you very much. I haven't had the chance yet to talk to Robert John Lewis Lattington yet, but I know he's here. Hello. I was looking around. Great to meet you.
I'm at least here.
You're here. Will Gianluca Crispi be here as well?
He's not, no. He's back in Nairobi, I'm afraid.
Okay. So you will be representing the project for both of you.
Yes.
So let me just briefly introduce the project and yourself. I made very briefly because all of that will just take away time from your presentation. So just briefly, the project, as you can see, our fifth flagship project here is on how to improve accessibility of water and sanitation in slums, which I think is a very crucial topic, very central to the human rights approach as well to water. And let me just say this, I think our speaker is currently chief of the legislation unit at UN Habitat, and just to sum it up very briefly, has worked in various advising consultancy functions in the past before, and also published rather widely in the field. And I'm really looking forward, hoping to have the coffee break, if there's a coffee break, having an extended conversation with you. But now the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to the organizers and for everybody for paying some attention. I'm almost alarmed as a lawyer to sort of change the pace of the discussion in a way and come away from the sort of immediate practical delivery to look more at the systems angles. Within our legislation unit at the Human Settlements Agency, the fundamental problem that we've noticed, and now I give my next apology to the lawyers, is two fundamental problems. One, there is far too much law, and two is that most of it is not very good. It's not well designed, it's not well thought through, and it sits around on the books. And as Gianluca, who is my colleague who did a lot of the groundwork on what I'm going to present today, as he will tell you, I very often refer to frequently zombie laws, which I love the terminology, but the idea of a law that exists, but it's not really alive. It doesn't really have any funding, it doesn't have any institutional support, but every now and then it pops up and bites you and causes a problem. So our aim is very much to try and clear out as much of that as we possibly can, and then work with countries to look at systems that will actually deliver the objectives that they've identified themselves. So we're not coming with model laws, we're not coming with pre-packed clever solutions. It's much more about what do you actually want and what direction do you go. Are we able? It's stuck. Okay, well, yay, we're there. Excellent. Right. So one of the things that we've started to do, we started mostly with physical planning and development control, was to start to look at how not so much can we do a ranking or can we sort of do a critique, but how much can we help cities and national governments assess their own frameworks and get them into a discussion where first they have to identify what do they really want, and two, to start measuring, do they actually have any tools designed to achieve what they want, and what are the likelihoods of success? I will admit up front that there is a sort of slightly loaded element to this because the criteria that we apply are based on the principles that Habitat and our partners would say represent good practice. So there is a subjective element underlying all of this. But the aim is to walk through with partners saying, what have you got and does it fit what you're after? One of our particular concerns and what led to the slum upgrading work was that slums tend to very frequently fall in a very particular situation, which is that there are all kinds of laws and regulatory frameworks that affect them. But they're very rarely particularly focused on slums. Slums are an incidental issue to those areas. And two, there is no holistic overview of what's going on in the slum. So the water guys are doing this, the electricity guys are doing this, the planners are doing this. Where does it all come together and interact? So we were trying to provoke a discussion that would look at the interactions a little bit more and get people to move forward in that way. If we can go on. Right, so I mean, the numbers sometimes vary a little bit and are disputed, but we're dealing with very large numbers of people. I mean, up to 1 billion. Yes, coming through the Millennium Development Goals and moving into the SDGs, the great controversy that over slums, we met the goal of the SDGs by moving a great number of people out of slums and raising their standard of living. The problem being that at the same time, more people were coming in and the problem was increasing dramatically. Fundamentally, slums are about exclusion. One of the things, I mean, we often have a to and fro of should we be talking about slums or informal settlements, particularly when you talk about informality. By its very nature, that's a legally defined concept. You are informal because you've been excluded from the formal. And that is the heart of one of the things that comes in with one of the issues that we're looking at, particularly when we're looking at water. Many of the people in slums are specifically excluded from the water system because they are excluded from the legal and administrative system. In some cities, they simply don't exist. You go to look at the spatial plans and the slums are simply not there. So there is no ability to plan for the infrastructure, plan for the delivery, because there's no ability to even recognize the scale and nature of the situation. So to try and shift that exclusion around to inclusion, we also see this as fundamentally a human rights issue. There is the obvious link, again, I will, because of the forum, pick specifically on the water aspects. You're dealing with the right to water and sanitation, part of the right to adequate livelihood. It's a fundamental right, it's non-negotiable. But we're also dealing with procedural rights. There's a question of how cities are run. Who gets to decide where the budget gets allocated? Who gets to decide where the priorities are? Who gets to decide how you manage the charging structures and these kinds of things? Okay. I have got one of these, all right. I'll try and catch up with technology. So this is basically a view of how the very summary of the tool comes out. We look at the 5 different dimensions, tenure security, so mostly around land rights and things. That tends to have a lot of knock-on impacts. For example, in a lot of the countries that we were looking at when building up the indicators and the data, access to utilities is often very tied to your tenure. So are you able to show that you've got an address? Are you able to show that you have some rights to the land? If you can, then you're entitled to get a connection. If you don't, then you're likely to have a harder time. This varies a lot within countries. We've recently completed a pilot in Kenya, and different cities have different approaches to this within, because they've got different water operators. So in some, you can simply show up with an ID card and ask for a connection and they'll do it and they won't ask any more questions. Others, you've actually got to come out with title-related documents, or an interesting document which they often issue in Kenya called an occupancy certificate. They call it that, but it has no legal status whatsoever, and it's issued at the discretion of your local chief. So basically, if your chief likes you, then you can get one. And if he doesn't like you, it might be harder or take longer. Again, not a great way of having a consistent system. But we're looking at the different dimensions. We're always looking at accountability, equity, and inclusion. I stress we're very aware at the controversy that sometimes occurs over the concept of equity, that it's based on fairness and the cultural specificity of fairness. We're trying to look at a more neutral overall level of fairness and equity that we would relate to the SDGs under goal 10.3, I think it is, where it asks for increasing equality of outcome. So we're looking at, can we spread that out equally enough? We look at 2 sides in each element of the assessment. So each of these 5 is basically split into 2 areas. The first area is functional effectiveness of the law. As it was described very bluntly and directly by a colleague, does the law do what it says on the tin? Now, where that starts is, did the law actually tell you what it intended to do? We frequently run into a situation with utilities regulation, with planning, where the government never actually declares what the objective is beyond we are going to regulate this area. If you're dealing with a very vulnerable population, that can become a problem because you then don't have a benchmark to measure the law against. It becomes difficult for administrative forums, judiciary, and others to measure whether the government is fulfilling its obligation or not. It's also hard for a legislature to monitor the executive. So we like to see, are there clear objectives for the law or the regulations? The mechanisms and processes that are in place, what the law actually does. It says an institution will have this power, or it sets up an approval process. Are those clear and are they easy to understand, or are they rather sort of vague and ambiguous, potentially prone to manipulation? Are the responsibilities and roles clear? Very often what you find in a weak governance scenario is everybody blames everybody else. It's a bit like when I'm negotiating with my children, I suspect. No, it was her, it was not, no, it was him. For example, again, coming back to the Kenya pilot, we have a situation where you have the water operators, but then you also have an essentially government agency, a sort of parastatal agency that's responsible for capital investment and supporting the water operators. And the water operators have universal service obligations, but those are conditional upon the capital being provided by the parastatal. So very easily, if you run into a situation, you can have the objective reality of somebody either has service or they don't. So you go to the water service operator, you are meant to deliver service. Why haven't you? Well, it wasn't me, it was because he didn't give me the money. Then, well, the fellow who didn't give him the money then says, well, you didn't fill the conditions under your service agreement, so I therefore didn't do it, or Treasury didn't give me the money, or whatever. So at the end of the day, you start spinning round in circles, and nobody is really responsible for anything. So you need, in these institutional responsibilities and roles, you need to get as clear and straightforward a set and pattern as you can to be able to segregate, okay, you should have done that, you didn't do it, I can hold you to account. Otherwise, you start getting difficulties. The ambiguity and the standard of drafting, probably the most extreme cases I come across with this are where you've got countries operating in multiple languages. The reason that becomes difficult is where the different language texts are all considered equally valid, but they say different things. That's a classic extreme problem. Okay, I admit that's probably at the unusual end. You can usually catch those. But it's that kind of thing. Do you actually really know what your law and regulation says and what it requires? Another country we worked on on a number of occasions, they kept putting footnotes in the legislation saying, if you don't understand what the law says, for the sake of clarity, here's what we meant to say. That's a pretty big red flag that you have a problem with your law. It also runs into the question of when you come to a dispute, does the note have any force? Should it be considered? Or is that something that's just there for the fun of it? So to try and make sure that you avoid all kinds of ambiguity and that the standard of drafting is as high as you can have it, there is a very great tendency to say that once we figured out what the policy is, we can write the law in 2 days and there's no thing of worrying about it. And well, any lawyer can be a drafter. I mean, admittedly, I'm biased. I'm principally a drafter. So we'd like to stress there are different breeds of lawyers. Don't hire somebody who is really good at conveyancing to write land law. It's not the same mindset. It's not the same skill set and process. So making sure that you've got that up to quality. And the capacity to implement. One of the most common things, and all of my colleagues will tell you that I hate more than anything, is it's a really good law, but it's just not implemented. Most of the times you will find people can cite very clear reasons why things aren't implemented. They're not implemented because we haven't got enough people or we haven't got enough money, and when we do, it'll all be fine. When are you going to have enough money and people? If it's not going to be for the next 40 or 50 years, there's a fundamental problem with what you designed. You designed your law wrong. As somebody once described it, you can't take an engine from a Maserati and drop it into a tractor and expect to get very far. So you need to look at what fits to your own circumstances and what your reasonable ambitions are. I'm going to run through most of the sectors relatively quickly and then focus on the water element. One of the things when you come to the technical side, so this is much more about the policy of what we're talking about rather than the harder law side now. So when we're looking at these, we are not trying to get comprehensive indicators. What we're trying to look at is what are the key list of elements that if those are there, probably the whole system is reasonably well thought out. And if they're missing, you're bound to have a problem right from the start. Because if we have too many indicators and we end up with hundreds, it's very expensive, very time consuming. Everybody gets lost in the detail and you kind of miss the message of have you got a well-designed system or not. So we're just tending to look at basic indicators, not everything that we go through. Coming to the basic services side. So the legal accessibility, what I was referring to before, the basic questions of what does it take to be legally recognized by the provider and to administratively fit into the system. To be able to go and fill in a form and say, please connect me. Is that simple? Does it include everybody or is it exclusionary? Very often it's highly exclusionary. And there comes your first barrier. The physical accessibility, the questions of universal service, the proximity of service to households. Very often there are quite realistic and quite sensible things about progressive implementation of rights now. We recognize that everybody has a right to water, but the government can't do it all overnight, so they have the recognition that they can progressively implement that right. Well, then the question becomes, who do they progressively implement it to first? Do they progressively implement it to the people who have the money and have the influence to be able to push things forward? Or do they have a prioritization of low income? And how are they realizing that? Measures to ensure affordability. Amazingly, some countries still outlaw cross subsidies, saying that this is unfair. Most countries don't do that anymore, but looking at how cross-subsidization works, looking at how minimum lifeline supplies work, these kinds of factors. So to look at affordability in that sense and how the law reacts to that. And is there an obligation for the state to subsidize? Is it committing to that? Or is it just saying, well, we'll try when we've got some spare money? Looking at how that works and how that is integrated into budgetary priorities also matters. I agree very often with people say you can't over allocate your budget, but similarly, you don't want to under allocate and leave it completely open. And then what are the regulatory standards like? Disconnection, how long does it take? What does it take to be disconnected if you can be? What does it take to be reconnected if you're disconnected? Do you still get access to a lifeline supply if you're disconnected? All of these different factors have to come in. And then the standard settings on quality, safety, and quantity, because you obviously have a balance there, as you always do, that if you can set a very high quality and access standard, and then suddenly the system can shut down because of that. But similarly, you don't want it too low. Where is the right balance to keep the system functioning and moving through? And we would put in various measures through that. Housing again, then financing side and the others. What we're aiming at as a first step with this tool is to get a much greater level of self-awareness of, particularly amongst the administrative and political class in a city or country, about what's going on and what the key factors in their decision-making ought to be. Where the time and the resources are available to do it, we recommend using this tool basically to facilitate discussion groups and to have a series of different groups. So where you have, for example, a city in sub-Saharan Africa with 50, 60% poverty levels, have a focus group focused on discussing amongst the actual users of the supplies, the people who live in the slum areas, about their experience of this. Have a separate group with some of the administrators, separate group with some of the national group, and then once you've got some conclusions onto the table, start bringing them together and then interact. And you can start developing an agenda for reform out of that. the problems tend to come to the fore fairly quickly. The aim is also in a fairly short, I mean, normally law is a fairly long-term game. You're looking at putting something down and hoping to have an impact in 5, 10, 20 years. We usually find with this that we can prompt a quicker sort of administrative rethink on some issues, just simply because people conceive of things a different way and they look at the relationships between factors a different way. That, for example, in Kenya has worked quite well, partly because we were lucky on our timing. The government was already thinking about developing legislation on slum improvement, and we were able to conduct a series of consultative sessions in the run-up to that, and they're now feeding that in as part of the evidence base for their reform and the proposal of the bill. And then we will measure according to that. We are just about there, if I get this the right way around. Links into the SDGs, obviously we're looking at the slum-related SDGs, poverty, water and sanitation, electricity, inequality, cities, but also the question of peace, justice and institutions. If people don't feel that they are treated fairly, if they don't feel that the institutions that they're faced with are effective and transparent, they're going to be alienated from the process. If they are part of the design and they can see and touch that they are part of the design of the system, then you're going to get a much greater level of ownership and a much greater level of accountability. Slowly building, but a little bit at a time. And then really just some of the places we've been working on this and some of the conclusions. Kenya, we've run through already, and we've had requests from 3 cities in Iran to work through with them, and that will be the next round. Particularly if we're able to use some of the resources that may come out of this, then that's probably where those would go. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for the concise presentation, also remaining strictly within the time limit. That's excellent. And I'm sure it will be very interesting in the discussion also to look at the concrete applications like in the past in Kenya, but then also forward-looking prospectively to look more closely at how you are thinking about implementing this in Iran. And of course, being a legal academic myself, I would find it specifically interesting to investigate to what extent you would also always have to adapt to the local specific legal system that you have, or systems, in fact, actually looking at also aspects of legal pluralism or other things that you can come across. So to what extent the system is versatile to actually set. But I will not exploit my role as a moderator. I am not a judge or a reviewer in this sense. So I will stop myself right away and I will ask the judges, first of all, to take questions. We have about 15 minutes for that. And then I think we are in a luxurious situation of having another 5 minutes at least for questions from the auditorium. Please, Ivan.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And as a former member of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the relations with UN Habitat was always very, very fruitful, and that the committee has done, in fact, 2 general comments, the one on forced evictions and the other one on the right to housing. And you summarized that very, very well. But my question really relates to which instruments to reduce the costs for those living in poor livelihoods. You mentioned tariff and subsidy structures and payment modalities. Which instruments do you foresee, and how effective are those measures if you compare your experiences from Kenya and then transferring those experiences to measure what happens in Iran? And the second short question regarding arbitrary disconnections, what concrete measures do you foresee?
The first part of my response, I'm tempted to be the typical slippery lawyer and say, you see, these are policy questions and the experts will tell me what the answers are. However, going on the experience that we've had, I would look at a couple of things. First, on the question of the payment of funding affordability issues. I think where you're dealing with more than about, well, in fact, in any situation, even if you're dealing with a relatively limited proportion of low-income populations, there's no escaping the fact that you're going to have some kind of public money involved somewhere. Now, whether that comes direct or indirect, whether it's the public rerouting of funding sources or whether it's direct central government funds, that's a different question. But I think you're going to have some public money in the equation. The fundamental problem that very quickly leads to is many of the cities that we're dealing with, particularly in lower income countries, are tapping a very limited source of their possible funding. Property taxes are next to non-existent, fees and charges in many things, particularly in the wealthier part of the city, are limited. And until you crack that, you can't really get the overall income levels up. In the meantime, I think cross-subsidies are largely, as long as you can manage them politically, technically, and practically, are quite an attractive option. Shoving up a percentage on your highest income and your industrial use, and then using that to provide the supply. Similarly, I would still be looking to try and put in some residual capital and maintenance investment coming from other public sources on a recurrent basis as well. On the question of accessibility, I mean, I think what we would always try and look for would be a means of ensuring that there is always some kind of minimum livelihood supply accessible no matter what. Now, if you're dealing in an area that already has public accessible water points, water stands, water kiosks and things like that, that's probably a little bit easier to manage because you can potentially allow for some cutting off of a household supply provided there's a proximate public supply. If that isn't there, it becomes more complicated and you start getting into metering, which then becomes more expensive and everything else anyway. But I think, I mean, if we're going to genuinely stick to the point that water is a human right, then you can't cut it off completely because you can't cut a human right off is the approach that I would take. But yeah, there will be complexities on how you achieve that.
Oh, thank you very much. Who would like to go? Callum Clench, please. Yeah.
Thank you. It seems like a very ambitious tool that you've created for complex, very complex situations. I guess my question is certainly looking at the work you've done in Kenya and thinking forward to Iran. How do you measure, the impact of this toolkit? I mean, in terms of you mentioned awareness raising. I guess is that awareness raising just at the policy level, or is it also at community level? Are you able to measure impacts on actual legislation and the changes to legislation, and also enforcement, which you talked about, in terms of where there may not be political will to actually act, even though the laws are there because it's the right thing to do on paper, but in reality, there just isn't the will to do anything. So how are you measuring those kind of impacts that you might get from having this data and this analysis?
Yeah, politicians and political will. Hey, that is permanently a headache. The part of the thinking that is built into this is, potentially the mischievous element of being able to manipulate the situation a little bit. That if you can highlight the questions and you can get the right people around the room and get those people engaged with what the issues or questions are, they have a greater ability to increase pressure on the politicians to act. Because it's the standard thing of if you shine a light on something, and that's really the logic here. It doesn't tend. The reason we tend to like to use the tool as a consultative process rather than to come in saying we've done an analysis and here's what you need to do is, again, that question of how it's received. It's a lot more successful to develop the relationship and the partnership with people and bring them along rather than to come in and say, hey, we know what the solution is. But at the end of the day, there's no silver bullet to this. It's a long grinding process of building up. but trying to focus as well on what can really work rather than what sounds like a good idea. Because working through the discussions on these key indicators pushes you towards yeah, but how can I do that? How can I do this? What about more of this, less of that? It gets you into that level of discussion, which becomes innately more realistic. How would we measure? I mean, it's twofold, because one, the easy measure is to look at the impact you're having on policy and law and regulation, because you've got a simple objective standard. Is it in black and white or is it not? Then the next level is to work through and say, well, how is this actually being implemented? Is there any kind of determined effort, or is it just on a shelf? Because if it's on a shelf, frankly, we've failed, really. And then the final one is it having the effect that you wanted if it is being implemented? Ultimately, I would look at that as about a 10-year cycle, where you're looking through at intervention, pushing it through to actually get it onto the ground, and then reviewing what happens, and then saying, did it actually end up with the outcome we wanted, or have we got to rethink again? But I think that's typical of most sectors in a way, that you've got to keep reviewing and cycling around.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go next, please? And yeah, we
Thanks,
stay in the same kind of order from left to right. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. I think it's very interesting. I have a general question and a very specific question. One is, how do you define this technical set of indicators? Is something that you define in the organization by UN Habitat? Do you socialize that? Do you adapt? It changes, or is a closed list? Is a one fits all, or do you calibrate the tool? For example, you have done this example in Kenya. Are you going to make some changes to the context in Iran, or is it just like the same tool and same set of indicators? So that's one thing. And the second thing is, I'm particularly interested in sanitation. It's a service which is provided in slums, usually in a different manner, with on-site solutions, more at the household level, and not with sometimes a service provider. So which are examples of normative you're looking at, particularly for sanitation in slums? I will be very interested in hearing about that. Thanks.
We don't see this as a closed tool, either geographically or temporally, if that makes sense. The assumption is that this will be an evolving thing. We have another one that we've done in the past on planning and development control. The idea is we're fairly constantly tinkering around with it, but periodically you sort of have to set down version 1, version 2, just to be able to give other people access to it. The idea is you shouldn't only be able to use this if UN Habitat is a partner. So we've sat down, we have a narrative explanation of how it's intended to work. That is version 1. As and when it evolves, we'll probably do a version 2. What we would like to do in the interim would be have a web accessible version where people's adaptations can be posted, and we can say, well, here is how it was adapted there, here's how it was adapted there. So it is intended and expected to be evolutionary in nature. We have found so far, generally, we haven't had to do a whole lot of variation geographically, but this is because, one, we've been working mostly in countries where the fundamental concern, with this one particularly, it's slums, so it's a limited range of countries with some fairly constant characteristics. There are some variations, and I think one of the first things, if the time and the resources allow, we suggest that people do before even going into the discussion is some background research. So in Kenya, we did it ourselves, of pulling out what are all the legislation and regulations that affect this, mapping that out, and then having some preliminary discussions with people about what their experiences were. So we could triangulate what was going on a little bit. I think in any country we would do that. We've done that with the planning version. And that tends to lead to some issues of, okay, this indicator doesn't really work here, or the variables that we've put under that indicator are not right for this country. But the idea is it really also not to get too hung up on the weightings and the scores, because we don't want people ranking themselves and trying to compare. The idea is more an internal discussion of, okay, 4 is good, 0 is bad, but within that, it doesn't really matter whether anybody else got a 4 or a 2 or a 1. Think about how you feel about what you got and how it works through. On the question of sanitation specifically, I mean, the basic variables that tend to come up with any service is still the thing of who has an obligation to ensure that the service is provided. What are the technical options at their disposal in a theoretical sense, and how do those connect to the affordability? So, for example, if you're dealing with sanitation in many cases, compared to at least a few of the places that we've worked so far, compared to where water delivery is often highly privatized in many of the cities we're dealing with now, sanitation is still much more of a public function. So you have a slightly different equation, and that goes straight from public to the household rather than through some kind of corporate entity in between. So we would be looking at that as a factor. You're also dealing, well, I suppose in both cases, there's underlying it the big public health question, which changes the public relationship to the issue. It's not simply about providing the service, it's about the need for that service to avoid a negative impact on the rest of the community as well. So there's that factor in there. But it still comes down to the same kind of variables. Who provides? What's their obligation to provide? Is that feasible in your context? And who are you expecting to pay for it? And then you can map out that and start looking at, because the aim of the tool is to get people to ask the question. The tool itself pushes you towards certain types of answers, but it doesn't give you the answer. It says, have a conversation with yourself about, have you asked this question? And if you have, honestly, 9 times out of 10, the group are able to come up with, well, actually, it would be better to do it like this than like that, without us having to say anything. And probably more effectively than where we would say something. So that's really what we're pushing for. I know that's a bit of a fiddly answer, but somebody once told me, if you ask a lawyer a question and they tell you either, if they don't reply with either it depends or another question, then they're not telling the truth.
Thank you so much for your presentation, which I found very, very interesting. I actually have a comment that will lead to my question. You mentioned, you started your presentation focusing on the ambiguity of many, many norms and regulations, of existing norms and regulations. But as you know, like law resorts to natural language to draft, to prescribe and to define. So I think we do have to take into account the intrinsic vagueness and ambiguity of natural language, of the legal terms which are drawn in natural language. So I think that as much as we try to remove ambiguity, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because ultimately it is institutions that are called to interpret those norms that are the ones that are key, so to say, when they interpret, that will implement those norms and that will be responsible, as you say here, for example, enforcing that those basic services, for example, in the case of basic services, are attained. Which leads to my question. Does your toolkit, you mentioned the institutional responsibilities and roles, right? So does your toolkit foresee the technical capacity, specifically, for example, with a human rights-based approach, that could be necessary to, so that those legal norms and so that those norms and regulations that are very specifically written are actually put into practice?
Okay, you can tell there's a lawyer coming with the question now. No, but thank you for those. They're very good points. I mean, on your comment, I think you're absolutely right. It's important to note that ambiguity is not always bad. The joys of strategic ambiguity, where you do it on purpose because you know you're going to need flexibility. What we're more concerned about, and what we're trying to target in there is on the unintentional, where the drafting leads to uncertainty, either in what should be delivered or who should be delivering it. I think a conscious decision to say we need to keep something open on a particular point, provided everybody knows that, is okay. But it needs to be out in the open so that the public and the users of the system can understand it. I think that question of the capacity comes back again to what I would call legislative design, really, for want of a better phrase. Making sure part of your assessment up front has to be in any city or your country, really. What kind of resources are you playing with? What have you got available? What are you going to be able to develop within the next 10 to 20 years to deliver? And then can you design accordingly? It's an extreme example, but it's a true one. On planning laws, we had one country where they had a beautiful post-colonial planning system with 6 tiers of planning from national down to local. First question we asked them was, how many registered planners do you have? And they had 1 in the entire country. It's from the very beginning, it's going to be impossible to do this. And that breeds corruption and it breeds collapse of the system. So I think one, design for something that's rational with the capacity. The process of discussing the detail of how it should work develops capacity itself, because people themselves start understanding, hey, I never thought about it like that. I never saw that this connected to that. And you get a much greater familiarity with the system than people would have otherwise. It's not somebody drafting off in a back room and then coming and saying, here it is, I'm going to train you on it. People have discussed through what's going on and they've worked up through how they design it. That creates a bit. But then, yeah, you will still need some external support in many situations as well. If you've only got one technical expert, you're going to have to look at how you expand that number, but also how you bring non-formal or semi-formal expertise to play as well. But I think one of the keys, particularly with the slum system, is it can't be an overly expert process. The more you can bring communities and individuals into the discussion and that they can own parts of that and ask questions directly, the stronger the system you're going to have. So that's what we would certainly aim for.
Thank you very much. We do have a couple of minutes at our disposal. So with the permission of the judges, may I invite questions from the auditorium, and may I ask them to be brief and succinct so that we can have a couple. Please, over there. Yes.
Hello. I really enjoyed the presentation. My name is Bruce Wilson. I'm from the University of Central Florida and the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway. So here's my question, because you're a lawyer, and it seems that courts as an institution are left out of your discussion. You're telling people how to get politicians to comply with law or builders to comply with law, but there's an entire other way that you could actually get politicians to comply, and it's not by knocking on the door, right? It's taken to court. Is this something that's not germane to the countries you're looking at, or that's it?
So I think you may want to answer that directly.
Sure. Absolutely, it's something that we do consider. But 2 things I would say, the 2 ways particularly we're looking at that. First, you want to get the strongest system you can for the courts to oversee and to implement, because it just makes their job simpler and it makes the signals to the court different. Second is by working through this process and bringing out more detail about where the weaknesses and the gaps in the system are, getting more people engaged, again, that gives more room for courts to get involved and to say, hold on, government, you're not doing what you should be doing. Because the courts can only deal with what is put in front of them. And part of the intention with this is that we would rather avoid a dispute if it comes to it. But if you do end up having a dispute in a society, which is always going to be inevitable eventually, that it is easier for people to be able to bring that forward, and they've got more more and better information to rely on when bringing that forward. So it's easier to pin down who is responsible and what were they meant to be responsible for.
Thank you. 2 further brief questions and answers, then I have to close the list. One's over there and then one here in the front. Please. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Thanks. My name is Dinesh Suna. I'm the coordinator for the Ecumenical Water Network of the World Council of Churches. As a representative of the faith communities, as you would know that faith communities are huge drivers of change, particularly behavioral change, when it comes to sanitation habits of people also in the slums. It makes a whole lot of difference. So have you thought of collaborating with faith communities? That's the first question. Second is about the issue of affordability. As we know that the rich pays much lesser compared to the poor for the same accessibility of water. Particularly, we know that human rights to water doesn't necessarily mean that water should be free, but it should be affordable. And affordability is for some people free, then it has to be free. And a government in New Delhi in India has made a rule now that up to 600 liters of water per day per person would be free for all. If you exceed even by 1 liter, you would pay the full price, just like anybody else. A kind of a safety net. Have you thought of doing some lobby with your politicians in, let's say, Nairobi, implementing something like this? Thank you.
Maybe we add the second question right away, and then you take them both if you agree. Yeah, please.
Hello? Okay. Kaveh Bazargan, ACM Sikai. I'm originally from Iran, so really happy to see that there are 3 cities that you want to investigate. So since 2006, the UN Habitat has been partnering with APAMCHUD. It's the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Housing and Development, which is more than, I think, 65 countries. And the next APAMCHUD, which is the 7th APAMCHUD, is expected to happen in Iran. So I was wondering, do you have any experience of implementing the tool you presented in Indonesia and India? Thank you.
Okay, the first one, faith communities, from our point of view, we're very, very happy to collaborate with anybody, well, within reason. But mostly that would get driven by an assessment of what's happening on the ground wherever we were working, and looking at who are the key actors and who absolutely must be at the table versus who could be if there is time and space available. In terms of the provision and the financial options, I absolutely agree, but sometimes there is the political space to do it and sometimes there isn't. I would prefer to see an option, as I said in the earlier comment, where we did have as a default that there was a lifeline supply guaranteed regardless. Because if it's a human right, it's a human right, and it's not something that you can take away for any particular reason, in my view. But that is tricky to achieve. I think also when you're looking at the finances of what people pay, I think it's, just to add one point, that I think it's very important to also look at where the public makes the capital investment. Because frequently what we're finding in cities is that the capital investment budget is also skewed towards wealthier neighborhoods, particularly when you put it in per capita terms. Whether the reasoning of that is to do with pressure on the public authority, or whether it's to do with, for example, that situation where the slum doesn't exist on a map, so therefore there is no obligation on the government to deliver legally, so they don't. Whatever the factor is, getting a better balance in the investment. And not just a better balance. I mean, I think basic social policy says you should be favoring those who are least able to get the service on their own. That's where your priority should be. So we'd work through that. The questions on Iran, yeah, no, I mean, it was great that the Iran office came and said that they had cities who wanted to do this. It's always useful for us. We will certainly look through what happens with APAMCHUD. That's usually run by our regional offices rather than the headquarters thematic content. We would make all of these things available to our regional offices and then hopefully they push them. But we're also happy to deal with anybody else who is interested in this. We haven't done anything in either Indonesia or India with this tool yet. but that's simply because the first draft of this tool we finalized around September, October last year, and between September, October, and now we've been running the Kenya pilot, because there are always a few things that you end up shifting around when you first run it out. So we haven't tried to scale up yet. Going on further will depend really purely, partly on who asks. We like to have a political commitment to do it. We're quite happy to work with non-government agencies as well, but it just makes it easier if you've got a local or a national government authority who says, I want to have this discussion, because there's somewhere you can go with it. And then the other is just time and money. But having said time and money, we're totally happy to make the materials and have discussions with anybody who wants to do it on their own without having to pull us in. So all of those are options.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to wrap up, even though we would probably all love to discuss this further, as exciting as it is, and probably being also happy to hear, when you said once a human right, always a human right, so the project clearly seems to be geared towards implementing the human rights. And I would appreciate if you are still around, discuss further from the lawyer's perspective as well. But I think what is really great to hear this in the wider context of why we are here is that this is also about implementation and the necessary flexibility that you need. So as you said, it's about asking the right questions in a structured way without always bringing the answers, which might then be perceived as some kind of an intrusion, and that's exactly, I think, what it is not meant to be about. I think you made that quite clear. So I think talking about the 881 million, potentially more or less, that live in slums, this is clearly about leaving no one behind. So thank you very much for your talk and for responding to the question. And I think I would like to thank everyone for the questions, and the judges and the auditorium, but thanks in particular to you for the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, even after the event, if you want to email questions or want the materials or whatever, please do so. Very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, our presenter, and Dirk, our moderator. I would like to introduce Geraldine Green from WaterLex, who's going to moderate Flagship 6.
Hi. Today I have to use two hats. Now I'm going to be a moderator, and in a few minutes I'm going to help our Pedro Carrasco from Ecuador. Going to help him with the translation. The flagship number 6 is how to make rural drinking water sustainable. There are lessons from Latin America. As a Latin American that I am, I'm very proud to introduce to you Pedro from Avina Foundation. I only would like to quote what Leo Heller said on the opening of the 8th meeting of OXAS last year. He said, I am convinced that community management of water and sanitation are an important management model which can facilitate the fulfillment of human rights for water and sanitation, promote equal, universal access without discrimination of water and sanitation services for an important population from urban and rural areas in Latin America. The proposal is to systematize the expert experience around better management of community water and sanitation systems and their sustainability in Latin America. The systematization will document the main learnings of the region, register the main tools and methodologies constructed and validated. Pedro Carrasco, as I said, from Ecuador. He is a civil engineering with specialization in sanitation, master in public health, working with Avina Foundation since 2014.
Señoras, señores, buenas tardes. Como ha dicho Geraldine, mi nombre es Pedro Carrasco, vengo de Ecuador y soy parte de Fundación Avina.
My name is Pedro Carrasco. I come from Ecuador and I am part of Foundation Avina.
La presentación que compartiré con ustedes se titula o está enfocada a cómo asegurar la sustentabilidad y la sostenibilidad de los sistemas de agua rurales. Y compartiré con ustedes las principales lecciones desde Latinoamérica.
The presentation that I will share with you in the next few minutes is entitled How to Make Rural Drinking Water Sustainable, Lessons from Latin America.
Fundación Avina es una fundación latinoamericana. Trabajamos desde el año 1994 y nuestra forma de trabajar es unirnos a los esfuerzos institucionales multisectoriales que buscan generar impacto y que buscan apoyar de manera adecuada al desarrollo sostenible. Trabajamos en 19 países y tenemos también representación en Europa, en Estados Unidos, y actualmente trabajamos en África también.
We are a Latin America foundation created in 1994, focused on producing large-scale changes for sustainable development through the construction of collaborative processes between actors from different sectors. We work in 19 countries in Latin America, and we have collaborators in the United States and Europe. Since 2015, we have presence in Africa.
Desde el año 2009 hemos podido contribuir a que al menos 3 millones de latinoamericanos y latinoamericanas accedan a agua segura.
Since 2009, together with its partners, the Avina Foundation has collaborated so that more than 3 million Latin Americans have access to safe water.
Algunos datos que vale la pena compartir y quizás muchos de ustedes los conocen. En Latinoamérica, aún 24 millones de personas acceden a agua no segura y no gestionada. Y 195 millones de latinoamericanos acceden a servicios no gestionados y no seguros de agua potable.
In Latin America, according to data from the Joint Monitoring Program, 24 million people in access water not safe and not managed. 195 million Latin Americans have access to water managed in a non-secure way. 90 millions do not access sanitation, and 142 million Latin Americans have access to sanitation managed in a non-secure way.
En este contexto, visualizamos e identificamos más de 145,000 organizaciones comunitarias a lo largo y ancho de Latinoamérica que brindan servicio a no menos de 70 millones de latinoamericanos.
In this context, in Latin America, there are at least 145,000 community water and sanitation organizations, OXAs, which work tirelessly to guarantee access to service to more than 70 million people.
Sin embargo, estas organizaciones aún son poco visibilizadas, poco reconocidas y los marcos legales en los diferentes países son poco favorables. Las organizaciones comunitarias trabajan en la mayoría de los casos sin recibir remuneración ad honorem y son parte de la historia de Latinoamérica.
However, they are still little visible and recognized, and legal frameworks in general are unfavorable to community water management. The community organizations of water and sanitation in Latin America are groups of neighbors who dedicate their time to the administration, operation, and maintenance of the system for free.
El trabajo incansable de las organizaciones latinoamericanas busca que día a día haya un ejercicio pleno de los derechos humanos, del derecho humano al agua y al saneamiento. Las organizaciones trabajan en el cuidado de sus fuentes de agua para garantizar el servicio y el recurso a futuro. Las organizaciones en muchos de los casos ya trabajan en control de calidad de agua. Las organizaciones trabajan para que el agua pueda llegar en lo posible y en el mejor de los casos a cada una de las viviendas.
The OXAs are part of the history of our region and have preserved ancestral practices and local customs and traditions related to water. The OXAs work to guarantee the human rights to water and sanitation. One, they seek to ensure that the service is available when required in the home, that's accessibility. Two, they work in the care of their water sources to ensure current and future, that's availability. Through public connections or public kiosk, it is to guarantee, that's affordability, and consolidate community system have basic water quality controls.
Y la participación de las mujeres es fundamental desde hace muchos años y cada vez con más fuerza en la gestión, operación y administración de los sistemas. La mujer en las OXAs, en las organizaciones comunitarias, tiene roles de todo tipo, administrativos, de operación y mantenimiento, y cada vez más en la toma de decisiones sobre el recurso y sobre el servicio.
The participation of women is fundamental for an adequate management of rural water systems. In Latin America, there is a growing participation of women in management positions, administrative tasks, and decision-making space.
La gestión comunitaria es muy importante y fundamental en Latinoamérica, y desde Fundación Avina y nuestros aliados hemos realizado trabajos desde hace varios años para garantizar la sostenibilidad de los servicios. Nosotros queremos que las inversiones, que los proyectos que se ejecutan en los diferentes países y en la región sean sostenibles, que funcionen y que sirvan por muchos años.
From Fundación Avina, we have been supporting community water management process and their sustainability for more than 10 years. We consider that for the sustainability of rural water system, at least 4 fundamental pillars are required.
Ok. Y consideramos el trabajo que hemos realizado en los últimos años nos permite llegar a algunas conclusiones. Y la principal es que para que los servicios sean sostenibles, mínimamente son necesarios 4 pilares fundamentales. Pero estos pilares fundamentales tienen que trabajar articulados y tienen que trabajar de la mano para garantizar esa sostenibilidad que buscamos. Los 4 pilares a los que nos referimos son fortalecimiento de capacidades, asociatividad, vínculos público-comunitarios y generación de política pública y sostenibilidad financiera.
In Fundación Avina, we consider that the only way to have this sustainability is using at least these 4 pillars. They are the key elements for the sustainability. One is training and technical assistance. The second is associativity, economies of scale. The third is favorable legal framework, and the last one is financial sustainability. But they have to be working together. They have to be together, like a 4-pillar together.
Gracias. Y consideramos que hay algunos proyectos pilotos en Latinoamérica que reúnen ya muchas de estas condiciones. Uno de ellos es AJASA, como la Asociación Hondureña de Juntas de Agua en Honduras, Aquacol en Colombia, en Nuevo México tenemos una experiencia, Senagrab en Ecuador, CISAR en Brasil, y el trabajo inicial en África nos permite identificar que también hay modelos similares, en este caso en Tanzania con el Water Service Facility.
At the moment, several successful cases of organizations that have achieved levels of consolidation in the mentioned aspects are identified in the region, among them Senagrab in Ecuador, CISAR in Brazil, one in New Mexico, AJASA in Honduras, Aquacol in Colombia, and also a successful case in Africa, Tanzania.
Ok. Y desde esta mirada hemos trabajado para poder trabajar en cada uno de estos pilares. En el caso de fortalecimiento de capacidades, desde Fundación Avina y las organizaciones aliadas, hemos logrado consolidar el programa de fortalecimiento de capacidades, que actualmente tiene 12 contenidos temáticos y que cuenta con el aval ya de algunos gobiernos de la región y cuenta también con el aval de no menos de 5 universidades en diferentes países.
Working with this idea of the pillars, he's talking about the first one, training and technical assistance. To support the process of strengthening local capacities, Avina has generated the training program with 12 thematic contents adapted to the local needs and which currently has the endorsement of several universities in different countries and from some governments too.
Y paralelamente contamos con un aplicativo para el diagnóstico, monitoreo y evaluación de los procesos a nivel comunitario y local.
In addition, an application has been generated to facilitate the diagnostic of the current situation of the OXAS and the monitoring and evaluation processes of impact. The tool in mention are of free access at the moment in Spanish.
Ok, para el segundo pilar fundamental, consideramos que se han logrado avances muy significativos en Latinoamérica y al momento existe asociatividad a nivel subnacional, nacional e inclusive regional a través de CLOXAS. ¿Para qué buscamos asociatividad? Para generar una economía de escala en el que las organizaciones comunitarias se asocien y formen un grupo más amplio, capaz de incidir, de trabajar con los gobiernos y de apoyarse con intercambio de conocimientos y aprendizajes entre organizaciones.
Avina supports the creation of OXAS sustainability centers in several countries of the region which have the following characteristics. They are social enterprises, non-profit but non-loss-making. They offer necessary services to achieve excellence in the management of OXAS. They work based in memberships. They contribute to strategies for the sustainability of the OXAS in a specific geographic region. And the work is based on values of solidarity, equity, transparency, responsibility, and teamwork.
Sí, perfecto. Y el tercer y cuarto pilar fundamental se basan en la generación de centros de sostenibilidad que son justamente aprovechando la asociatividad entre OXAS, la posibilidad de generar servicios, de generar asistencia técnica, de generar mantenimiento de los sistemas, de generar almacenes para insumos e inclusive laboratorios para el control de calidad de agua. Hay algunas experiencias ya interesantes y validadas en la región, pero que generan sostenibilidad local. Es lo que ha acabado de decir Geraldine hace un momento.
The services provided by the sustainability centers, this is the third pillar, are technical assistance, coaching and mentoring, comprehensive capacity building, to develop diagnostics, to control of water quality, supply of materials in situ, accounting services, information system, risk management, adaptation to climate change, and protection of water sources.
En todo este proceso se identifican algunos factores de éxito y algunas limitaciones. Me voy a referir a uno de los más importantes a nivel regional, y es que en Latinoamérica se identifica prestación de servicio público y prestación de servicio comunitario. Y el modelo o la propuesta tiene éxito cuando los dos sectores conversan. Cuando los dos sectores llegan a acuerdos y generamos acuerdos ganar-ganar con participación del sector público y comunitario.
The main success factor identified for the sustainability of OXAS, because what Pedro says is that there are some good things and other not too good, then when the success factor because there's this important difference between the public service and the community service is the concretion of public-community agreement. This is fundamental because in most countries there is no dialogue and agreement between public entities and community organizations, and they do not recognize their complementarities. The collaborative work with NGOs, development agencies, and universities is very important too. The management of information systems to know the current situation, monitoring and evaluation of processes, and working on the real and priority needs of the community is fundamental.
Ok, y por último, también se ha desarrollado a nivel regional una herramienta, una metodología que nos permite medir impacto. Nos permite medir el impacto social de estar organizados y de acceder a servicios de agua y saneamiento. Esta metodología ya ha sido validada en Ecuador y en Colombia y consideramos que es importante. Consideramos importante tener datos firmes sobre qué impactos se están generando con la mejoría de los servicios y con los niveles asociativos y poder validar nuestras hipótesis.
Avina Foundation has developed a participatory methodology to measure social impacts around access to adequate water and sanitation services. The evaluation has been applied in Ecuador and Colombia with very relevant results regarding the advantage of being associated and having sustainability centers.
Nuestra propuesta es generar una sistematización que signifique aprendizaje, que signifique compartir experiencias a nivel de la región y a nivel de otras regiones en el planeta. Nosotros esperamos sistematizar y aprender de todas estas construcciones en Latinoamérica que han sido desarrolladas de manera separada, no están articuladas aún. Yo decía al inicio de mi presentación que son 4 pilares fundamentales, pero que deben estar articulados y conectados para que la propuesta de sostenibilidad tenga éxito. Entonces, hacia eso va enfocada la propuesta.
How he said at the beginning, there are 4 pillars that have to be connected between them. Is the only way to succeed with this idea. The proposal is to systematize the experience around better management of community water and sanitation systems and their sustainability in Latin America. The systematization will document the main learnings of the region, register the main tools and methodologies constructed and validated. The testimonies and learning will be included from local actors about the process of improving their systems. In principle, three pilot countries have been considered.
Sí. Consideramos que los 3 países que tienen al momento los avances más significativos son Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador. Sin embargo, en la sistematización se enfocaría los aprendizajes en general de la región.
In principle, the 3 pilot countries have been considered Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Colombia, but could be revised and adjusted
Pero de manera amplia hacia los otros países, sí.
Okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
The systematization period will be 6 months?
Sí, 6 meses y
after which we hope to be able to socialize and disseminate the learning to other regions of the planet.
Exactamente. Nuestro sueño es que los procesos en Latinoamérica y en otras regiones del mundo sean sostenibles. Muchas gracias.
Our dream is that the process in Latin America and the rest of the world being sustainable. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judges, you have questions?
Okay, thanks so much for the presentation. I'm going to translate myself. So I will do it in English first and then in Spanish. So I have two questions, and I think the first one is if you can expand a little bit more of information in that impact assessment tool, which I think.
Slow down a little bit.
Sorry. So the first question I have is if you can expand a little bit more of information on that impact assessment tool that you mentioned that was tested in, I think it was Colombia and Ecuador. So I think I would like to know more. I'm sure that the rest of the judges would like to know much more about that in terms of when was it done, what type of impact evaluation was done, what were you looking at, and the particular results that you found. And the other question is, I understand that you're presenting the whole package, all these different blocks as a project for the sustainability of rural systems. But my question is how this is institutionalized. And particularly for the first blocks, for the blocks that you mentioned in terms of the capacity building program and in terms of the diagnostic tool for community water organizations, what is the buy-in of the government? I mean, because the associations is a bottom-up movement in general in Latin America, but how you always need government support and you always need government buy-in for this. So I know that in Latin America you have other systems for monitoring like CSR, so how this other platform is integrated into that. So those are the two questions. I think I talked slowly enough, and I'm going to change this into Spanish. Tengo dos preguntas específicas. Una es en relación a esa herramienta de impacto, de evaluación de impacto, que creo que queremos saber más todos, un poquito que nos cuentes cómo se hizo, qué estudio se hizo, de qué manera, cuándo, dónde, y un poquito más los resultados que estabais buscando y que encontrasteis. Volver un poquito más a ese slide. Y la siguiente pregunta es en relación a la institucionalización de los procesos de asociación. Has presentado varios bloques y en concreto el tema de formación de capacidades y de la herramienta de monitoreo en un contexto en Latinoamérica en que ya existen diferentes herramientas, en que muchos gobiernos ya tienen desarrollados sus procesos de formación de capacidades de las OXAs, tienen también desarrollados sistemas de monitoreo en rural, como es el CSR, pues un poquito que nos cuentes cómo se institucionaliza este trabajo. Gracias. Thanks.
Vamos por cada pregunta, sí.
Well, for some time now, we have been concerned that we have said that our projects do bring about an impact. Nonetheless, we didn't have the processes to be able to measure that impact. And in recent years, we had an alliance with ACBA. They're a French consulting agency. And what we did was that we applied a methodology that comprised of taking a number of organizations which do have organizational and training processes, and also to identify a number of communities that don't have these. And what we're doing is we're undertaking a comparative analysis, and we're looking at what the social impacts are of having access to water and also this associative link. And now we'll have the floor translate into English.
Okay, I'm going to try to remember, excuse me. What we are...
Hemos trabajado con una consultora.
So I was saying that we worked with the French consulting agency. I talked about the social impact.
That's it. Pedro was explaining that they made an alliance with a French consultancy firm, ACBA.
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 AQWA.
ACBA.
ACBA.
Aqua. And they have done, for what I understand, an impact evaluation with a control group of communities. They analyzed communities that they didn't have any capacity building processes and other communities which had capacity building processes in place.
Los resultados han sido concluyentes.
The results were conclusive in Colombia and Ecuador. We did this, and there are at least 17 different impacts that come along with having access to water. Access to water means that you can achieve a number of impacts in terms of health, time gains, and savings when it comes to the use of family resources. There are also impacts in terms of boosted self-esteem. As I say, in total, there are 17 that I can say were reported on. I'm talking about a public report, and I can certainly assure you that these processes are achieving the impact that we have sought for, and even more so.
They have analyzed 17 impact indicators in regards to health impacts, in regards to savings, in regards even to self-esteem of in the community. So they can share all this information. I don't know if it's going to be published. ¿Va a ser publicado?
Es público y está en las...
Yes, it's public. It's a public report that you can find on the website.
Of the results of this evaluation.
Y con respecto a la siguiente pregunta.
And now to answer your following question, the complete name is a program for boosting training. We didn't want to create an additional program on top of what already exists. So what we did was we created a regional alliance involving a number of university organizations. For example, the University of Cajamarca in Peru, they've got a lot of experience, Aguatuya in Bolivia, and Camarin in Ecuador. And so our program draws upon the expertise of all of these other programs, as well as other government programs, such as the CICE program in Nicaragua. And in this capacity building program, we included some new modules in the current context. And one that we found was particularly successful was that which involved OXAs as social undertakings.
Oh, sorry, I'm not a translator, so my memory is not that good at this age. So the name of the program, of the capacity building program, is the Unified Program for Capacity Building or Capacity Strengthening. That means that they have tried to develop the capacity building curricula jointly with many different types of organization, including universities from the region, including local NGOs, and they have based their proposal in existing proposals, even from the FICE, from Nicaragua, from throughout all the region. And one of the modules he's going to talk about is the first, well, I don't know which one is it, the number, but the one that it's related to considering the water community organizations as social enterprises.
Sí. Y es importante que
It's important that these community organizations have this concept of a social undertaking. In other words, they are not profit-making. And of course, our colleagues say they also don't want to be loss-making. Thus, we're talking about a broad vision, tapping into economies of scale. And this is a model that we have come up with together with the communities, and it is one that is successful. I do want to add something along these lines. There are a number of governments in the region. For example, INADI in Panama, they have already institutionalized this system, and in other countries as well. Some local governments have also given consideration to these programs, and we believe that this is where we want to get to, because the program needs to be permanent. one of the mistakes that frequently is made, that a program is set up, but it's then neglected, and we want for it to carry on.
Model in regards to considering the water community entities as social enterprises is one of the models which is working best. What they are trying, or what they see, is that the communities, they don't want to profit from the water services, but of course they don't want to lose money, and they don't want to get into losses. So that's one of the models that has been much more well received. And just to add a few more examples of the government buy-in of the capacity program, the government of Panama at the national level has already observed this capacity building methodology, and also different local governments in other countries.
Thank you, Celia. Questions? No questions? No?
I have a very small one, and that is, you mentioned in your that in the 6 countries where Avina has done excellent studies on this, which can serve as precedents, in relation to the question of advocacy and roundtables. Could you say a little more about the advantages and disadvantages of and limitations that you face in organizing roundtables?
Te referiste a 6 países en las que se habían realizado algunas mesas redondas con participación de diferentes actores, y él quiere que le digas ventajas y desventajas que vieron en esas actividades.
Sí, nosotros identificamos.
As I was saying a moment ago, we noted that the community sector and the public sectors have not been communicating in recent years. I think we could even say that they were quite distant. They were not on the same page. And sometimes it seemed that they were not compatible. Therefore, that the work that we have done is that we have set up space for dialogue involving both the public sector and the community sector. And what we have wanted to do is to facilitate communication between them. We want them to understand that they are complementary entities, that they are not competing with each other. And we believe that these efforts have been successful. I would say that some of the obstacles we came up against were political. There is often a high turnover of municipal staff, and also the same in the community sector. Sometimes the geographical distances are a further obstacle. Moreover, often the legal frameworks in the countries are often not favorable to us. Therefore, we have been seeking to revise public policy involving both of these sectors.
What he said is the public sector and the community sector have been separated. They don't like to work together. And then what they did is to make this table, table that for dialogue, and to create or generate agreements between the both different groups of people. But the problem normally is the politic voluntary and the changes of the leaders in the politic sector and in the community too. And the other problem is the legal framework that they are a problem. And what they want to do is build alliances between the different groups.
Okay.
Sí. Maria?
Yes, I actually have a question. I'll make it in English first and then I'll translate to Spanish if that's okay. La voy a traducir al castellano. Actually, from what I've gathered from what you said, is that this impact assessment tool, the goal of it is you would be empowering at the same time the OXAs through all this capacity building you've been doing, not only with this impact assessment, but with all the work you've done in the region. At the same time, you could be providing governments, it could be some sort of capacity building for governments, in the sense that you could provide them with monitoring in this, from these 3 successful experiences, right? Entonces, mi pregunta es, por lo que usted ha dicho hasta ahora, mi pregunta era, bueno, ¿cómo es que usted va a usar esta herramienta de monitoreo? Por lo que entiendo, está empoderando al mismo tiempo a las OXAs, no solo a través de esta herramienta de monitoreo, sino a través de todo el trabajo que viene haciendo Avina, sino que al mismo tiempo estaría ofreciendo un capacity building, o sea, la capacitación, el fortalecimiento de capacidades para los gobiernos, para que puedan usar justamente estas experiencias exitosas en la región para traducirlas en sus políticas, implementaciones y demás.
Sí. Es justamente.
Yes, indeed. One of the problems that we are witnessing in Latin America, and I think around the world, is that we don't have up-to-date data. Often, we say that once we actually have really identified the problem, we've already got halfway to finding the solution. As a result, at the level of governments and organizations, we are looking at being able to start with recognizing what reality is. And that's why we need these diagnostic tools. And then we also want to have accessible, easy to use monitoring tools for the community sector. The idea is that they should be able to measure the outcomes, measure the impacts. And then at the end, we want to have a tool that will make it possible for us to quantify these impacts. Thus, what we are doing is creating a system, a package, if you like. It's kind of like a toolbox, including a number of documents. And our focus is on how to generate sustainability in rural communities. So we are talking about the process and also the results.
One of the main problems in Latin America is the lack of legal and updated data. The idea here is the promotion of knowledge of the situation through this diagnostic tool, which would be easy to use to measure impacts. And ultimately, they want to systematize all the knowledge they've gathered from these successful experiences. Like it would be kind of like a toolkit focused mainly on sustainability in rural areas.
Y quizás algo más.
Perhaps, if I might, I'd just like to add very briefly. All of these tools are linked to the use of technology.
Related to the use of technologies.
Y sistemas de información.
And IT systems.
In Spanish, it's like put everything in a bag and together is what he said. It's like make a big kit tool with all the different tools and
systematize it.
And systematize the use of them. Yep. No more questions for the judges? May I open the questions to the audience? Anybody with questions?
I'm going to ask first in English and then Spanish. My name is Alejandra Garza. I'm from CAPTAR organization in Chihuahua, Mexico. And I want to ask if the foundation only funds organizations with water management. And the other question is how or who's the one that is doing the measurement of the results of these organizations? La pregunta es si la fundación nada más ayuda a organizaciones que tienen programas de agua y si y quién es el que hace ¿cómo se dice? La evaluación o los resultados, las medidas de resultados de las organizaciones que ustedes están apoyando.
Fundación Avina trabaja en...
Avina is working on 9 thematic strategies. One of them is access to water and sanitation. We have other strategies that are linked to the climate and to migration. We've also got a regional initiative on recycling, and we have some other strategies as well. But the reason I am here is to focus on the issue of water. And if we look at who is measuring impact at an official level, the answer is that it is official national offices who should be responsible for this process. And what we do is we provide the tools, we facilitate communication. And of course, we also rely on participation of all of the experts involved, academics, etc.
Excuse me. They working with 9 different teams or strategies. One is water and sanitation. One is others are migration or climate change, and a lot more. And the impact measure is do by the organizations, different organizations of the state. You said, I don't got it. No.
Para la medición de resultados.
It's for measuring official results. When it comes to measuring official results, we work together with the official organizations in each country.
The official results is the state who say, the government who give the official results.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's interesting. I'm going to do also in English and then in Spanish. There is an interesting point of dialogue between the public organizations and the community organizations that Avina is trying to facilitate. But from the point of view, my question is, while the public organizations might have public support, in the community-based organizations are leaders that volunteer their work. So I can see that there is not a common understanding, nor common treatment, and the job they are doing in this process is not recognized. I don't know if I am wrong. Me parece interesante el trabajo que Avina realiza en el sentido de tratar de llegar a un acuerdo entre las organizaciones públicas y las comunitarias. Entiendo que las asociaciones que están vinculadas al sector público de alguna manera tienen el soporte económico para que funcionen y a la vez son organizaciones tal vez mejor articuladas, mientras que las a nivel comunitario cuentan solamente con el trabajo voluntario de algunos líderes. Entonces no hay un balance en este proceso. ¿Cómo están haciendo ustedes para disminuir estas diferencias? Más o menos esa es la pregunta.
Gracias. Las organizaciones...
Thank you for that question. The community organizations are not new. In Latin America, we have identified organizations that have already existed for 60 or even 65 years. This is why we are saying that they are a part of Latin America's history. And these organizations are indeed doing a lot of work without the economic support and frequently without expertise, and often it is just goodwill that is passed down through generations from grandparents to parents to children.
Not new in Latin America, they are part of our history. Some of them have 60 or 65 or more years, and they do without recognition. They pass between families.
Avina trabaja en el fortalecimiento de...
We have been working in capacity building both with the community sector and the public sector, and we are working on awareness raising to facilitate dialogue. And we have countries where we have clear examples of this. For instance, in 2014 in Ecuador, there was legislation on water, and this was the result of participation from community leaders as well.
A lot of different examples in Latin America. One of them are the law in Ecuador that was built with the participation of the public and communal sectors. I think we are with the clock on time saying we have to finish, then please can you...
Ok, pero nada más para concluir.
Okay, I'd just like to conclude and say that these differences that you've mentioned do still exist. It's very difficult to get a balance between the public sector and the community sector. It's very difficult for them to be able to work on equal terms. This is a challenge still today.
Stay there. It's very difficult to know which one is the good or the best solution, and we have to deal with it. And I'm sorry, but the time is finished. And yeah, thank you very much, Pedro, for your participation.
Thank you, Pedro, our presenter, and Geraldine, our moderator. I would now like to introduce Anders Johnson, President of WaterLex.
I'll be very brief. I'll start off by thanking all the presenters of the projects that we listened to today. Thank the judges and the moderators, and very particularly thanking all of you for being here with us, and for the interest you've shown, for the questions you've raised, and for giving us encouragement to continue with a journey that starts today in this room with this first World Summit. Then I'd like to say that, or remind us that we're talking about leaving no one behind. And when we talk about leaving no one behind, we are very often, in fact, invariably talking about those who are left behind in every society, the people who are the vulnerable people in society. We know who they are. They're not the same persons in every society, but they are women. They are people who are leaving on flight, refugees, and there are people who live in isolated rural areas. There are people who live in slums. There are those who are discriminated against in one form or another. And I think that what is common for the 6 projects that we will listen to today is that they're all addressing one or more of these people who are left behind. So they're certainly topical for this summit. Then I'd like to remind us that when we sent out the call for papers, we said that we were looking for innovative solutions, that we wanted to be economical, and we also wanted them to be easy to implement. And I think that I have certainly found this a very educational experience, I must say. I've learned a lot of things I had no clue about. And in several instances, it seemed to me to be very simple things. We just don't think of applying them maybe in the circumstances. So I think that also from that perspective, the projects I've been listening to have been innovative, although they might have been innovative in other circumstances already. And they are not high-flying, very expensive projects, and they certainly seem relatively easy to implement. Now, we are coming at this issue from a human rights perspective. WaterLex is an organization that is founded in human rights, and it applies a human rights-based approach in its work. Those who have come to present the project are not all human rights experts, and they do not use, all of them, a human rights language. But they all deal with human rights nonetheless. And in fact, when you listen to them, and then some of the instances you need just to scrape a little bit on the surface, you realize that they're also applying a human rights-based approach. And that's been very encouraging to hear, that in fact we are all, in one form or another, striving for attaining the same goal. Now, WaterLex is an organization that deals with law, deals with policy, and deals with governance. And if there is one issue that has sort of come back time and time again in your proposals, it's about the need for regulations and how important law, policy, and governance is in the realization of these projects. So once again, from our perspective, this feels very close to home. And I'd like to end up by saying that what I also found, now talking about this rather personally, very heartening is that all of you underlined in one form or another the importance of participation. Participation of the beneficiaries. They are not objects, they are subjects. They need to be part of a consultative process, they need to be part in designing solutions, they need to be part in implementing solutions, they need to be part in monitoring and holding those who are supposed to provide services to account. So participation, if I would end up by using a single name or word, I would say it has been running like a thread through these presentations. I think I'd like to end there. I know that the judges are now going to retire into a room and they're going to decide, well, which is the one project that stands out more than the other ones. And I hope you will all join us for dinner this evening and you will find out first who that project is. Before I leave, let me just add that I felt a little bit, how do I say, insufficient at the end of this presentation from our colleague from Ecuador, and I'd like to extend a bit of an apology to him. It has not been possible to ensure translation into all languages, and I'll promise you that for the second summit, I'm leaving no one behind, and I'm firmly convinced that there will be one every year now for the coming years. There will be interpretation also into Spanish. We have to start somewhere, so we're starting with English and French, but we need Spanish, and we will also need other languages. With those words, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anders. Just a couple of quick notes. Tonight's Gala Award dinner is at the Intercontinental Hotel, which you may have noticed when you came in this morning. As you leave the building, if you look up, I'm going to give complicated instructions again, just like I did at lunch. But if you look up, you'll see the Hotel Intercontinental in front of you. It's about 200 meters away. Dinner starts there tonight at 6:30. So, and apparently we still do have some tickets left. So for those of you who don't have tickets, if you would like to go, please see one of our WaterLex folks just outside. Tomorrow morning, registration opens at 8 o'clock, coffee at 8:30, and will continue at 9 o'clock. Thank you all very much.